Really quick, to remind you of yesterday, we're running a few minutes behind because of the room change, so we may go a little bit over today, like by 5 minutes. Yesterday, I talked about how we have so much information. I have to work through so much history because my job is to give you the family tree, the history, the names, the dates, to set up Dr. Bennett to have a good systematic theological pastoral response. We have way too much to cover. And so yesterday, I used the metaphor of a stressed out parent grocery shopping. We have a list, we have no time, and we have a budget, and we got to get in, get out. We're going to pass a lot of interesting things. Today, I'm going to use a different metaphor. For better, for worse, my parents let me watch Scooby-Doo growing up. It's too late now. It happened. I've seen it. I enjoyed it. And so today, we are going into the creaky, dark, creepy basement of Christian history. Some really weird moments from the 1920s to the 1980s. We're going to get into this. We used the metaphor of a haunted house yesterday. Today, we're going to be looking at folk devils. There's a lot of interesting rooms. We're going to the basement. There's no time for the attic. There's no time for the drawing room, right? We got to get to the basement and figure out what we're going to figure out. So some of these historical periods, there's going to be a lack of nuance. There's some things that aren't mentioned just because of time. And we'll try to have a Q&A afterwards. I'm going to try to go for 40 minutes, have a 5-minute Q&A, and then while Dr. Bennett's getting set up, if you have to go to the bathroom, just go. There's not going to be a break because I know if I release some of you, I'll never see you again. So just stay here. Here we go. Chapter 2. Folk devils. And we're going to start, because you need frameworks for this, we're going to start with a book that came out in 1972 by Stanley Cohen called Folk Devils and Moral Panics. Buy it on Amazon, very interesting read. Basically, Stanley Cohen was a British scholar who wanted to figure out why a conflict at a place called Clacton Beach in the UK with some youth who did some vandalism suddenly became front page news for like 6, 7, 8 years. It's not that it was a good thing that happened, but the reaction society had was so disproportionate to the event. Everyone following so far. So he comes up with a framework that we've since refined and reshaped called moral panic and folk devils. And essentially, this is how it works. This is my summary. Moral panic is an overreaction to a real threat. I cannot emphasize that enough. There are real threats. There are real conspiracies. There's real evil. There's a real devil. But there's an overreaction to a real threat or an act of deviance. This threat or deviance is elevated to the status of a folk devil, now catch this, or a symbol of all that threatens society. There are 5 actors in a moral panic. There is the media, the public, law enforcement, legislators, and activists. I'm just noticing with some of my slides are out of whack. Oh, no, they're not. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. All right, we're good. So basically what happens, something occurs. Something bad happens. The media over-report it and sensationalize it. The public, we react, right? We have a freak out. And then we get law enforcement involved. Law enforcement starts over-policing. We demand legislators make laws, they do, and then you start getting activists showing up. And there is a slide missing. I'm scrambling ahead of myself. I don't know where it went. Basically, I wanted to illustrate this from the Bible. I believe it's the book of Numbers. I think it's the book of Numbers. The spies sent into Canaan, the 12 spies. Yeah, thank you. So what's going to happen with the 12 spies, to kind of illustrate a moral panic, is they are sent into Canaan to spy out the land that God is bringing them to. They come back. How many of the spies give a good report? 2. 10 people freak out. And essentially they say there's monsters over there. And you read the text as they spread a bad report. Everybody freaks out. They elect people to take them back to Egypt, and you basically lose the promised land over a moral panic. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so we're moving ahead. We're going to get into the 1920s. Early 20th century conservative American Protestantism was dominated by a theologically reactionary movement of churches and leaders who called themselves... Okay, I need more energy. Called themselves?
The Fundamentalists.
Thank you. The Fundamentalists were frustrated with how loosey-goosey many of their fellow Protestants had become. What we're going to get here is the mainline Protestants, your Episcopalians, maybe your some of your Lutherans, are getting their views of the inspiration of Scripture and the existence of miracles. We're not so sure about those anymore. And as a reaction, you're going to get the Fundamentalists who are like, no, every word is inspired, this is true, and you get this fight that's going to happen. We start seeing people, oil tycoons, Lyman and Milton Stewart, start funding Christian projects to push back against these mainline denominations. They're concerned about liberal scholarship. They create Biola University. They publish a 12-volume pamphlet. Whoops. You can see here that spreads all over the place. It's called The Fundamentals, and this goes out, basically warning everyone the mainline denominations are liberal, they're untrustworthy, we need to fight back. And so you're going to start seeing this split in the 1910s, 1920s between the fundamentalists and sort of what we'd call the mainline denominations, liberal. Michael Campbell, good friend of mine, wrote a book called 1919, The Untold Story of Adventism, Struggle of Fundamentalism. And he says, the war heightened eschatological expectations as Adventists saw in it the fulfillment of prophecy, again, coming after World War I. At the same time, they were envious of the success of their conservative Protestant Christians who garnered increasingly large crowds as they called the attention of the public to the soon return of Jesus. Adventist leaders attended these gatherings. There was these gatherings called basically prophecy conferences, right? All these Christians are gathering, they're forming, they're saying, hey, we've seen some atrocities, Jesus is coming soon, and Adventists kind of get jealous, they start attending, they're never invited to speak, we're still kind of outsiders along with the Pentecostals we talked about yesterday. So they noted minor theological differences the Adventists did, but they downplayed these and emphasized instead similarities and the significance of these events for Christian history. So what's going to happen in this debate is Adventists know we're not liberals, we're not mainline denominations, we fit a little bit more in with the evangelicals, so we start butting up to them a little bit. Everyone following so far? Okay. Big explosive thing happens with the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s. Essentially, the Butler Act forbids teaching evolution. A guy named John T. Scopes, a substitute, violates the law, and the trial became a public spectacle. It is the first trial broadcast on the radio, and it's framed by fundamentalists as the Bible versus science and tradition versus progress. Political cartoons on both sides go ape, if you will. Yeah, you're welcome for that. They feature all kinds of anthropomorphic monkeys in hilarious scenarios with their political cartoons. There's fascinating ones that deploy monsters and the devil. So you can already see we're starting to monstrify, and demonize the other side, right? So one is from 1925, and the other one's they're both from 1925. One is from the Memphis Commercial Appeal. The other one's from the Los Angeles Times on June 4. Essentially, the fundamentalists lose the public debate. They are shamed and made to look like, bumpkins, essentially. They're shamed in the public eye, and they retreat, and they realize that in order to survive in America, we need to create our own subculture, sort of a fundamentalist subculture. They come up with places like Bob Jones University in 1927, very, very fundamentalist conservative institution. A few years later, this isn't so much fundamentalist as it's more fundamentalist evangelical kind of blend, and that's Fuller in 1947. We also get publishers that are still around today that start publishing things. This is Sword Books, and they are publishing, as you can see, Christian recommendations for America and pins. This is from today, by the way, even though they started way back then. There's the Christian flag and the American flag together. So for them, they're like, America's under attack, it's under threat. We are the fundamentalists. We need to hole up here and push back. So that's what happens there. Later on, we get a man around this time, a little bit later, named William Branham. So again, we're leaving the fundamentalist, modernist debate behind for a second, and we're moving to what is happening with those Pentecostals we talked about yesterday. In 1906 with the Azusa Street Revival, 1907. We get a guy named William Branham. He starts leading healing revivals, claiming an angel is traveling with him, giving him supernatural insights. His work becomes kind of extreme later on. He starts claiming that Eve slept with a serpent, and that's how we got Cain. Yeah, and I won't even tell you where he goes with that, but he targets certain members of the population as being descendants of Cain. So some really weird ideas. Other people pick up on his stuff in the 1940s. There's a group that in Toronto, I believe, that call themselves the Latter Rain, or the New Order of the Latter Rain, and it's based on Joel chapter 2, something that's familiar to Adventists. I will pour out my spirit on your sons and daughters. They come up with the idea of a fivefold ministry that God was restoring apostles, prophets, evangelists, teachers, and preachers into the world. So what's happening alongside this fundamentalist modernist debate is charismatics, Pentecostals at this time are having revivals, and they are saying God is reinstituting the prophets, the apostles, these supernatural offices. Commenting on this history, in the early 1950s, again, as these revivals are taking off, In the early 1950s, there are scores of healing evangelists that are filling tents and auditoriums around the country, attracting tens, not tens, of thousands of people, reporting thousands of healings and other miracles, and collecting millions of dollars in contributions from supporters. You have Kenneth Hagin, you've got Oral Roberts, these kinds of people. So even though they are still on the fringes, as are Adventists in terms of the general Christian world, they are growing exponentially. Right, that's the landscape. Very rapid movement. But we need to get into a period that will shape a lot of the way we talk about certain things when it comes to spiritual warfare, and that is the Red Scare. And this is what makes me nervous, because some of you lived through this. I did not. I have to depend on sources from people like you, so I hope this is accurate. So in 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by a man named Lenin, overthrow the government across the pond, and it worries them, and Americans get worried that that's going to happen over here. So basically, we see communism, we see dictator, and it becomes a very real threat. We freak out, and we start getting paranoid that there is going to be communists and subversion, and they're going to come and take our America away from us, our democracy, our capitalism, our Christianity, and we get into this massive feeling of paranoia. Now, I want to remind you of our moral panic framework, right? In a moral panic, there is a real threat. Were there real communists?
Yes.
Are there real communists? Mm-hmm. Are there real spies in the world?
Yes.
Yes, are there real? Yes, these are all real things, but our reaction to this gets to be a little extreme. And so as we enter a Cold War period, we have an expansion of communism. There's totalitarian governments. There's nuclear weapons. There's espionage and subversion. And we need to fight against this. We need to push back on this. And so a couple of my slides did get mixed up. Oh, all right, so just bear with me. So I'm going to move back and forth. 1919, you got, anyone recognize who this is? J. Edgar Hoover, head of the General Intelligence Division, fears Bolshevism, conducts what's called the Palmer Raids. Thousands of people in the U.S. are taken without warrants and interrogated. Are you a communist? Do you know a communist? And instead of people pushing back hard enough to discredit him, we make him head of the FBI, where he sits for 48 years. Right? So this is largely condemned by people in history. You get a guy named Harry Truman, 1947. He delivers a speech known as the Truman Doctrine on March 12, 1947, basically wanting to send $400 million in aid for Greece and Turkey to fight against communism. This is where a lot of people suggest that the Cold War starts, this sort of conflict between us and the Soviet Union and their allies fighting the spread of communism. There's this massive conflict. Some of the tactics that are used during this period, one is called astroturfing, where we see corporate sponsors are sponsoring grassroots movements to fight communism. This makes sense. If you're a business owner, you certainly don't want communism. You want capitalism. We have a group called the John Birch Society of America, and then we have the American Legion. We have the KKK. They start linking African Americans and Jews to communist threats. They label the NAACP and civil rights movement communist. We have something called housewife populism that shows up. Housewife populism is essentially this activist group of housewives that start spreading anti-communist literature, wondering, is your teacher a communist? Is that local business owner a communist? Is our local representative a communist? And this just spreads. And what's something important to note during this time is you have anti-communist, capital A dash communism. That's an ideological stance. We're democratic, we're capitalist, we push back on that. Anti-communist, one word, all lowercase, is the propaganda that follows. And it explodes during this period. Something interesting to note, the Communist Party at this time in America is the only party, not the only people, the only party officially working in the civil rights movement. So what do you think happens in the minds of Americans? Civil rights and people like Martin Luther King Jr. are communist, right? So you remember we talked about yesterday in the anti-spiritualist political conspiracy how spiritualists were speaking to Abraham Lincoln, right? This is a ghost that's coming back to haunt us again, where it's like we're now tying the civil rights movement to communism. Another guy you have is Martin Lieberman's Committee of 1 Million. This is the idea behind this committee is to build this Committee of 1 Million to spread anti-communist propaganda. And when they interviewed him later, he said what it came down to was one individual, me, with a circle of influential allies who could get all these VIPs to sign the public statements we wrote, thus creating the illusion of an enormous people's movement. In other words, again, propaganda, trying to give the impression that this is a massive movement. The communists are everywhere. We get different executive orders, government orders that allow us to accost Americans and to say, bring them to trial. Are you a communist? Do you know a communist? You've heard of this guy probably, McCarthy, allegedly who had lists of communists, took off, and this is where someone mentioned Mormons yesterday. Mormons actually, according to a study I just read this morning, actually, in many ways, at least in Utah, really supported McCarthyism. This idea that I've got lists of communists, they've infiltrated the government, they're everywhere, spreads this sort of witch hunt mentality. He falls out of favor when he starts going after the army around 1954. They start realizing how reckless this man was. But the problem is the damage is done. These ideas, this panic is embedded in the minds of people. It's a lot of history. It's a lot. We'll slow down in a minute when we get to where I was alive, and I can speak to a little bit better. But as this is all happening, we have a new group that shows up called the New Evangelicals. And the New Evangelicals emerge because there is the fight between fundamentalists and the fight between mainline liberal Protestants, right? And there is a book that comes out in 1949 that says 100 Things You Should Know About Communism. Point number 60, are communists trying to corrupt religion in the U.S.? Yes is what it says. What's their method? Communist Party United States assigns members to join churches and church organizations, and you can keep reading, but essentially we have government propaganda telling us that our churches are being infiltrated by communists, which you can imagine. You already have a fight between the fundamentalists and the mainline denominations. What do you think this is going to do? It intensifies. So the churches do not escape the Red Scare. One of the main platforms where the fight is going to happen is on the radio. Fundamentalists and mainline Protestants are competing over airtime. Mainline sort of legacy denominations get free airtime for the government. Fundamentalists do not. The mainliners are like these guys, these hellfire and brimstone, like legalist fundamentalists. We don't want them on the radio, so they're fighting for airtime. And they both don't like the new evangelicals who are going to show up. So what's going to happen with the new evangelicals is they don't get free airtime, so they have to shape their programming around what's popular and dynamic, and they ask for donations to buy prime real estate. So, little point here, communication technology influences our theology. We forget this, all the way back to the Gutenberg Press. So what is going to happen is preachers like Billy Graham, who have Youth for Christ and becomes basically one of our best-known evangelists, is going to take to the radio. And the theology is similar to fundamentalists in the way that the Bible is inerrant. The devil's not confined to some metaphysical hell, but the devil's literally active and real in the world. They emphasize an increase in Satan's activity in the world. They realize that in order to survive as these new evangelicals, we can't be isolationist. America is under attack. The gospel needs to be preached. So they do these dynamic programs on the radio and really take off. And they start doing youth rallies like Youth for Christ. And some of the messaging that they give people, Pastor Oswald Smith in 1951 describes some of the messaging that they're sending out among people who was a kid in the 1950s? Few of you. Youth for Christ faces the challenge of invading five worlds: the Roman Catholic, the communist, the pagan, the Protestant, and the world of false religions. All of these worlds need to be evangelized. The three opponents which Youth for Christ must face are false religions, nationalism, and communism. These are the greatest enemies of Christianity. So right away we're setting up, we are under attack by demonic forces. There's that spiritual warfare rhetoric. Billy Graham writes an article in 1954 called Satan's Religion, where it's about, these are quotes and summaries. Communism must die, or Christianity must die. Cosmic war between two competing religions. Communism is the name of this present-day religion. Popular media and education and politics are all suspect. The satanic religion is capturing America. He writes another one, The World's Darkest Hour, 1958. And this is where we're getting out of the metaphysical and becoming very, very literal here. The problems of the world are not social. The problems are only, and you can kind of see how he's breaking a little bit from the civil rights movement. Right here. It's not social gospel we need. The social problems are only symptoms of a deeper problem. The problems of the world are not illiteracy, poverty. It's not social injustice. He said our problems originate from within, and he called it sin. We are told sin is of the devil. Jesus said he who committeth sin is of the devil. So you're getting a lot of, we're under attack, basically, summary, from some of our most dynamic, loudest voices. Now, what gets really interesting with Billy Graham as he emerges and they start dominating the Christian landscape, the evangelicals are definitely here, is there starts to be some partnerships between Billy Graham and J. Edgar Hoover. That's interesting. What we know from new research that came out a couple years ago is J. Edgar Hoover was a militant Christian. He used to teach in his cadet uniform Sunday school. He's Presbyterian. Very passionate about spiritual things, and so as he gets into office, he begins to want to use the FBI and his influence to really solidify and promote Christianity in the U.S. from a government office. The other thing he does is he embraces Jesuit Ignatian spirituality and integrates it into the FBI on spiritual retreats. Right? He's very open. It sounds like an Adventist conspiracy theory, but it's documented. I'll show you in a second. So he likes it because of its military background. So he integrates it into the FBI. There's a great new book that came out called The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover. It's a couple years old. This is something that he says in 1939. It's the address, the 25th anniversary of a layman's retreat in the Archdiocese in D.C., speaking to a group of Catholics. This Protestant says, as a Protestant, I, Hoover, say sincerely and from experience that the Catholic Church is the greatest protective influence in our nation today. That's interesting. By the way, this book that just came out from Princeton University Press, she had to sue the FBI to get files they wouldn't release to her that they were supposed to. Yeah. So it gets worse. Billy Graham coordinates with J. Edgar Hoover to start publishing for Christianity Today. They start cross-pollinating messages, mixing evangelicalism with American government and anti-communist literature. And so right here, every time the Bureau distributed Hoover's essays to Christianity Today, it did so on Department of Justice letterhead featuring the FBI emblem and the name of Christianity Today. Readers were assured not only of the magazine's patriotism and the central role white evangelical faith should play in the fate of the nation state, but also the importance of the FBI's place in evangelical faith and politics. Now, as good Seventh-day Adventists in the 1950s, how do you suppose, given our eschatology, we would respond to a militant Protestant who openly embraces and integrates Jesuit spirituality, praises the Catholic Church as one of the best defenses of the nation, and then partners with evangelicals to co-produce material? We should have been responding like this. This should have been every church office in the land freaking out, right? What do you think we did? We put him on the cover of our magazines and had his content too. 1955, on Signs of the Times. I told you yesterday that our Americanism haunts our Adventism. The other thing Adventists were doing at this time was working on an important book called Questions on Doctrine in 1957. And again, George Knight will tell you it's the most controversial book in Adventism. It's an important book. There's a lot of good things in here, but part of the backdrop of this is saying, hey, we're not communist, we're not crazy, we're not a cult, we are. Charismatics at this time have joined the New American Evangelical Association. They're building Oral Roberts University. I was a charismatic, by the way. I was Pentecostal through high school. I almost went here for college to become a charismatic Pentecostal preacher. So they are building, they are growing, and they have strong anti-communist rhetoric, so we're all sort of uniting around the Red Scare. Great new book from MIT Press that came out this year called The Shadow Gospel. It says, evangelical youth were trained to recognize these enemies in music, movies, and even their parents' church through loose demonological chains of association. If someone or something was connected to anything evangelicals already feared, that fear would be transferred to the newest threat. Through these rhetorical efforts, evangelical youth were primed to go to war with mainstream culture. Evangelical youth were told that the war had already come and that it was their sacred duty to fight, despite not entirely knowing who the enemy was or would be. Whatever's new usually is bad. So interesting. Now, Billy Graham had enemies too, and this is really interesting to point out. Bob Jones, fundamentalist in 1966, said Billy Graham is doing more harm to the case of Jesus Christ than any living man. And Bob Jones said that because his school was segregationist and didn't like how friendly Billy Graham was getting with people like Martin Luther King Jr. Tim LaHaye, to give you just an example of what the mood was, Tim LaHaye, who went on to write, part of the, involved in the moral majority, the Christian right, helped write the Left Behind series that was very popular among charismatics that talks about end times and spiritual warfare, wrote this letter to Wheaton College when they had a moment of silence after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. He says, "Recently this report came into my hands and I find it very difficult to believe. It seems incredible that a Christian college could participate in honoring an outright theological liberal heretic whose nonviolent demonstrations have resulted in the deaths of 17 people." That's where Christianity is at. Why this happens, it's complex. We have something in communication theory called the spiral of silence. And the spiral of silence operates on the idea that media is ubiquitous, and certainly during the Red Scare we had a lot of propaganda that's everywhere, right? So everyone we use what's called our quasi-statistical sense. Everyone is anti-communist, everyone thinks this way, and therefore I better not say anything, I better go along with it. We will silence ourselves. The other thing that is critical for you to note is the devil's terms. There was a work of rhetoric that came out in 1953 called The Ethics of Rhetoric, these tactics are still used today. Once you see this, you should be able to recognize them when you go out and follow various ministries and news outlets. Richard Weaver, his key ideas, he says, "We have ultimate terms. These are highly charged, abstract words that carry inherent rhetorical force and function outside of what? Rational scrutiny. We have God terms, which are inherently positive beyond question, and we have devil terms, inherently negative and creates moral panic." And I can tell you a bunch of them right now. Woke, liberal, conservative, fascist, immigration, DEI. I don't have to define those terms. I just throw them out there, and immediately, depending on where you are, you will rally or immediately separate yourself. These are rhetorical shorthand to bypass your thinking to rally you to someone's platform. We actually have a name, too, of the people who do this, particularly around moral issues, are called moralpreneurs. They see where people upset and freaked out, I can step in there and I can make some money and build a platform off of this. And so the point is, too many ministries preach God's message on the devil's terms. And so now we have folk devils. Spiritualists, evolutionists, communists, liberals, and now civil rights activists. And now we get to the 60s and 70s. And what I know from the 1960s is that it was a very calm period. It was a time of great turmoil and with a lot of a lack of faith in our institutions. Medicine, education, government, the church, all of it, and often with a good reason. It was a mess, right? And so one of the things that happens as people are disillusioned with conventional institutional Christianity is they turn to alternate spiritualities. New Age, right? The occult. We have the creation of Anton LaVey's Church of Satan comes out. Time magazine talks about this. And by the way, Anton LaVey started, there's a guy named Joshua Gunn who does rhetoric. He wrote a book called Modern Occult Rhetoric and said this sort of almost started as a humanist satirical parody. But when it hit the mainstream, it took off and became a religion. We talked about this author the other day, a colleague of mine who wrote this this year. It was not until the occult revival of the 1960s, a period which also saw young men and women rebelling against the post-World War II status quo, that the critique of spiritualism required redeployment. So we talked about the anti-spiritualist literature in the 19th century, and now we're in this period in the 60s, we need to redeploy. And so we start cranking out all kinds of books. That first one, I just wrote an article in Spectrum about R.A. Anderson, Secrets of the Spirit World. Look at that, there's a floating head in the cemetery. Pacific Press went really hard back then. Full of all kinds of sensational stories about ghosts and manifestations. You got a guy named Bob Larson, Hippies, Hindus, and Rock and Roll. Comes out. Bob Larson, Adventists loved him. We featured him in the Adventist Review several times. During the pandemic, he would perform an exorcism for $200 via Zoom. Yeah, to give you an idea where he's at, and we ate that right up. Fellow Travelers of Spirit, that's Ellie Froome. Again, basically warning you about just about everything. Again, there's good things in these books, but it's not that they're not responding to a real issue, but it just goes like overshooting the runway. And then The Cross and the Switchblade, very influential book. True story, influential story, but the way it's written, the way the rhetoric is, it tends to dial up the intensity a little bit. And then we get to a guy named Jack Chick in 1964. Jack Chick is a fundamentalist cartoonist who looked at comic books and the style of comic books and said, I bet I can really push the Christian message out if I copy this style. So he did, to the tune of 800 million of his comics distributed to date. That's from Yale University. You want to know what was being handed out? That has spread all over the world, including into Adventism? This is a panel from This Was Your Life. These are handed to kids, by the way. Look at this. For factual information on Satanism, read Lucifer Dethroned, the true story of ex-vampire? What really gets to Adventists is when he releases this. Alberto. The story of Alberto Rivera, the escaped Jesuit, who escaped the Catholic Church and has all kinds of dirt on the Catholic Church to tell us, to the point where Liberty Magazine more than once had to respond to Adventists losing their mind over the alleged escaped Jesuit. Multiple things about Alberto. He was proven to be a fraud and discredited, but that did not matter because his narrative fit our fear of the Catholic other. I have written articles, I'm not naming names in these sessions, I have written articles about one of our prominent speakers who has traveled around, and he literally took one of Jack Chick's comic books, plagiarized it, and put an Adventist veneer on it. Like you can trace the wording all the way back to comic books. And we eat this stuff up. Great book, highly recommend. Jason Bivens, North Carolina University, wrote a book called Religion of Fear, and he talks about how evangelicals loved what's called the erotics of fear. He says it's the desire for or fascination with that which is condemned or consigned to the realm of darkness and demonology. The religion of fear appears drawn to precisely what it seeks to drive away. So in other words, we're going to tell you not to read any of this stuff, but if we can frame it as a testimony, we can be as gross and sordid and sensationalist as we like, and it gives us a little titillation to read it. So we get to the 1960s, or in the 1960s, and Hollywood's going to respond. Now, if you understand anything about monster theory, it's a real thing, first of all. The first tenet of monster theory suggests that a monster is a cultural body. In order for a monster, particularly in media, to get any sort of traction, it has to mirror the fears and anxieties of the society that it's in. And what is happening in this particular slice that we're looking at? People are freaked out because the occult is on the rise. People are leaving Christianity. We're not critiquing necessarily, nationalism and the corruption of Christianity. We're just concerned about, look at all these other alternate religions that are coming up. And so Hollywood's like, hey, people are freaked out. We should put out some movies. The biggest one, of course, is this one, that we're still studying the effects of this movie. Here's another one. Here's another one. 60s and 70s. All of these films feature children being demonized. And if your parents and grandparents are already freaked out in the Red Scare and the Cold War and the rise of the occult, they are going to lose it. When The Exorcist came out, the Catholic Church was inundated with exorcism requests. Tons and tons of them. And at that time, they were like, we don't do that anymore. We're not trying to do that. So there was nobody there except these two, Ed and Lorraine Warren, who were ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, and then suddenly realized an opportunity. We're going to style ourselves exorcists, and we're available. A colleague of mine wrote a book with Oxford University Press last year called The Exorcist Effect. And he studies this dynamic that's about to happen, and this is just mind-blowing. Highly recommend this book, too. He says the Warrens had been researching haunted houses since the 1950s, but in the 1970s rebranded themselves as demon hunters and became celebrities when Catholic authorities turned away people seeking exorcisms. The Warrens stepped in and connected them with an exorcist. Keep following. In this way, the Warrens were almost living exemplars of the exorcist effect. They worked with people to construct narratives by drawing from cultural scripts that were widely accessible through horror films. And then they pitched these narratives back to the media for film adaptations. Anyone heard of the film franchise The Conjuring? That is based on the Warrens, and it is marketed partially to evangelicals. Supernatural horror films are actually part of a feedback loop wherein actual events become the basis of films. Those films shape the way audiences interpret the world, giving rise to new beliefs and experiences, and these beliefs and experiences lead to new events that become the basis of new horror films, and the cycle begins again. We call this feedback loop the exorcist effect. In other words, what we have happening is we have horror films and deliverance ministries trading tropes and narratives, and because you have all been taught, and we still teach people to ignore pop culture, people have no idea that what they're responding to is not good biblical theology, it's a horror movie. We start getting people like this showing up. This is Mike Warnke, wrote a book called The Satan Seller in 1972. Takes off, he's proven to be a fraud, lies, and extorting money. The whole thing is made up. But he ushers in a whole wave of alleged ex-Satanist narratives that find traction in the 70s. And then we get to a guy named John Todd. John Todd shows up in 1973, an alleged ex-arch-druid, Illuminati member, and he begins to go on the speaking circuit, and people eat him up. And he tells people the Illuminati are coming, they're attacking America, they're going to take Christianity away from us. It's happening. He has conspiracies for days. You can still access certain audio tapes of his, and it's chilling how he describes basically, the Beatles are secretly witches, and they put spells in their albums, and when you buy their albums, you take them home, and they haunt your house. He starts telling people that the witches in the world and the Illuminati all read the Necronomicon, which is a fictional book created by horror writer H.P. Lovecraft. But because good Christians and good Adventists don't understand pop culture, and there's no internet, we just write that stuff down. That sounds true. He gets international fame. He meets up with Jack Chick. Remember Jack Chick? Cranks out 2 comic books. Adventists eat this guy up. We put all kinds of things out here, even after he starts to become unraveled and defrauded. This is from The Gleaner, I believe, 1979, where even after he starts to be revealed as a fraud, later he was actually convicted of rape and pedophilia. Most of these guys that go in the circuit, major red flag. There are letters here talking about screaming cassette tapes, and when I put his cassette in, it stopped the screaming. All kinds of strange manifestations. And even after he starts being disproven, Adventists will double down and defend him. Who cares about his sins? He's telling us the truth. Scary. All kinds, more John Todd. All kinds of letters to the editor. Adventists eat this stuff up. His tapes make it to a guy named Kerry Noble, who is living in a very peaceful commune in the Ozarks. And he starts listening to John Todd, and John Todd, towards the end, starts talking about how there's going to be a conflict and you need to send us guns. It's a frightening tape to listen to. Christians buy into it. Kerry Noble and his commune, which was Zarephath Horeb in the Ozarks, gets involved with this. He shares it with his leader, Jim Ellison, and they go from this peaceful Christian commune in the woods, fleeing society. We have that narrative in Adventism sometimes too, don't we? And they start arming themselves. They buy $52,000 worth of arms and start preparing. They change their name. They link up with a white supremacist group called the Christian Identity Movement. They rename themselves the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. And they become a paramilitary organization ready to do battle. FBI busts them for illegal weapon sales in 1985. Another group of people get a hold of John Todd's tapes. And this is we're getting into the 90s now. He's been debunked. Group of people get into John Todd's tapes. They arm themselves. They prepare for conflict. In the conflict, the wife and the son and a marshal get killed of this guy. Heard of Ruby Ridge? John Todd's direct influence. There's another guy after this. There's somebody else watching Ruby Ridge and says, see, the FBI, that's just proof that the government is trying to come and take our faith and take our Christianity away. A guy named Steve Schneider. Steve Schneider went to school at Newbold. And later at Andrews, your friend. Yeah. Steve Schneider, we know, listened to John Todd, distributed tapes around Andrews University. Was a Branch Davidian, the right-hand man of this guy. John Todd's work is later repurposed in a book called Bloodlines of the Illuminati. You can download this on the CIA website. This is one of the books that starts spreading the rumors that the Illuminati run Disney World, which is picked up by several of our current independent ministries in the Adventist Church and circulating online right now. The author here, also proven to be a fraud and a criminal. The book takes off. We find it among the works that were held by Timothy McVeigh, Oklahoma City bombing, and even on the hard drive of Osama bin Laden. You can learn all about it. There's a great podcast called The Conspiracy Tapes. Check it out. They talk about all of this. But we pass this stuff on, and we get excited about it and hopped up on it. We have another book called The Late Great Planet Earth that comes out in the 70s. Sells 28 million copies, popularizes the secret rapture, and also that America, again, is under attack. It's followed up with another book called Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth. So all of this stuff is coming together, and I'm racing to make sure I'm done on time here, so Dr. Bennett has her time. We get to the satanic panic of the 80s. So all this stuff is brewing in the 70s to 90s, and what's going to happen in the 80s is we are having the dynamic of both parents having to go to work now. And so people are concerned about the children. They were already concerned about the children, but now it's heightening in the 70s. And now so children are being home alone, they're watching the television, who's raising them, and then we start passing certain laws protecting them against child abuse. So in the news, people are talking about not just the occult, not just horror movies, not just end times events and spiritual warfare, but we have some real social problems with our youth. So people are on high alert, and this book drops. Michelle Remembers is the true story of Michelle Smith, who, through her therapist, Lawrence Pastor, recovers memories of satanic ritual abuse. This is a sordid book with gross details. He helps her recover memories of satanic abuse. They go on the speaking circuit. They make $300,000. They go to all the talk shows. By the way, this is a therapy that's later disproven. It's highly unethical. They leave their spouses and get married to each other. There's a picture here. This is from People magazine. This is one of their therapy sessions. I'm going to say something right now. If this is you and your therapist, it is time to find a new therapist. Now, what's crazy is this thing is rocketing off, and everyone starts freaking out about Satanism and secret. Basically, she says there's the feast of the beast is going to happen. Satan is going to be incarnate on earth. We all have to get ready. Satan is everywhere. And we, evangelicals and Adventists, eating this stuff up. Later on, it's all disproven, false, and they interview Lawrence Pastor in the Mail in 1990, and here's what he says about this. It is a real experience. If you talk to Michelle today, she will say, that's what I remember. We still leave the question open. For her, it was very real. Every case I hear, I have skepticism. You have to complete a long course of therapy before you can come to conclusions. We are all eager to prove or disprove what happened, but in the end, made my money, got a new wife, who cares? We start publishing like crazy. We have a book, all kinds of spiritual. This is an Adventist one. You may have heard of Trip into the Supernatural. I'm only showing you these. This is currently debated among several people. That's kind of scandalous because this is one of our elder statesmen of Adventism. I'm not trying to besmirch anyone's ministry, but it falls in the same timeline, the same topics, the same themes and tropes as other books that have been disproven. Again, you have Bob Larson again, the guy who does Zoom exorcisms, is cranking stuff out. Lauren Stratford's book, Satan's Underground, is later disproven, but this stuff goes like wildfire everywhere. One of the biggest books is This Present Darkness by Frank Peretti, who's a Christian horror writer. And even though it's a fictional book, he anthropomorphizes spiritual warfare, and the images embed themselves in our cultural imagination and how we process things. Here's a line. First of all, opening, go right to Ephesians, so it anchors it in Scripture. Dr. Bennett's talked about Ephesians a little bit. It's about the town of Ashton that is overrun with demonic influence. And I want you to look at how he describes this part. Hank looked across the street at the impressive structure of the Ashton United Christian Church. Hank had known some terrific Christians who belonged to that denomination, but this particular bunch in Ashton were different, liberal, even bizarre. Leftovers from the Red Scare. Geraldo has exposing Satan's Underground that he later apologizes for. We have books like Turmoil in the Toy Box. Everything from breakfast cereal to your kids' toys have Satan on them. The McMartin preschool trial where people lost their jobs, went to jail because allegedly Satanists were operating in the daycare. It's the most expensive criminal trial in U.S. history because everyone is scared about occultists right now. They did some research. Here's the research. There were over 12,000 accusations of satanic ritual abuse in the 1980s. How many of those turned out to be true when we actually studied them? 0. Here's the end. These are bad enough situations without having the general population alarmed about some sort of satanic conspiracy. We agree. Now catch this. Our research leads us to believe that there are many more children being abused in the name of God than in the name of Satan. Satan wears a halo more often than horns. Friedrich Nietzsche, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. Quick pastoral thoughts as I'm wrapping up, and I know we're running a little bit over today just because we got started late. I want you to keep these texts in mind. Isaiah 8:12-13. Do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy, and do not fear what it fears or be in dread. Not denying conspiracies, but saying don't be reactive and believing everything. 2 Timothy 1:7. For God has not given us a spirit of what? But of power, love, and a sound mind. Ephesians. That's the spiritual warfare book for many people. We must no longer be children, tossed to and fro and blown up by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness and deceitful scheming. Pay attention to this stuff, the language and how it's framed, and how we can see for decades how people have been manipulated this way. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I have one suggestion for you. Since the devil masquerades as an angel of light, what if charismatic leaders claiming to be Christian manipulated our fears and theology to create panic? And out of that panic, we make sensationalist accusations that lead to evil results. Therefore, Christianity looks crazy while our theological opponents look rational and ethical. Finally, as I handed it over to Dr. Bennett, reminder from Sister White. Suspicion demoralizes, producing the very evils it seeks to prevent. If you like this content, I have a podcast with NAD called Beast and Bible, Apple, Google, Spotify. And tomorrow, okay, now the landscape, we're going to leave you. I'll take some questions as Dr. Bennett's getting ready. But as we leave this period, our landscape in terms of Christianity and spiritual warfare is populated with folk devils. That we use that rhetorical technique, the devil's. I just have to mention these things, and they've been around for decades, so they feel like they're just true. We just take them, we don't ask questions. So it's a little bit scary that way. But tomorrow, now that we've populated the landscape full of all these folk devils, tomorrow we'll talk about exorcising the demons, what we did about it. So, Dr. Bennett, do you want to get started right away? Should we wait? Can I do a couple questions while you're getting set up? Okay. Yeah, 1 and 2. You mentioned earlier. Yes. What I will tell you is the Jesuits infiltrating the church is a very... I will. Is it true or is it not true that the Jesuits are infiltrating the church? What I can tell you is that starts, there's something called nativism. I would highly recommend the book. It's out of print, called The Protestant Crusade. And it talks about a lot of the early American Protestant paranoia about the Jesuits. Samuel Morse, who invented the Telegraph, thank you, actually wrote a book called, the first part is called A Foreign Conspiracy, and he actually, it doesn't sell widely, maybe picks up a little bit after the telegraph is invented, and he starts making accusations that the Jesuits have infiltrated. When we get into the 1920s, 30s, there's a guy named Ben Wilkinson, who was part of the King James Only movement, and allegedly there is a letter from a former student that has never been verified that claims that the Adventist church was invaded by a Jesuit. It floats around on like Reddit, and 4chan, and other places, but it's not been verified. We get, of course, Jack Chick comes up and amplifies this. Now, this is true. I forgot to mention this. This is wild. In Jack Chick's works, Alberto and the alleged escaped Jesuit that was proven false. On part of the comic, he has a list of organizations that were infiltrated by the Jesuit church, and the Seventh-day Adventists are listed in the comic book.
Okay, wait. That's all the question you get.
Good.
Get out of here.
Yeah.
Kick rocks, like I said yesterday. 30% of that clapping is just in recognition of how fast you can speak. That is amazing. We appreciate it, Dr. Pierce. Thank you so much. Okay, so what I'm about to present is going to be different from what we talked about yesterday, from what I talked about yesterday, and it will be a little bit of a pivot from what Dr. Pierce was presenting, but you'll see there's some overlap, and it's crucial in order to have the conversation we're going to have tomorrow. So I'm so glad you're here, so glad to have the room full, because a lot of what we're going to talk about in the next let's say 35 minutes. I am committed to finishing on time, so we all need lunch, right? So I'm committed to that. So what we're going to talk about in the next 35 minutes, I think, is so important for understanding and getting insight into the discourse that surrounds us today and in which we are engaging. Now, last September, I had the opportunity to go. I spoke at a church in Manhattan, our Manhattan Seventh-day Adventist church in New York, and it was wonderful, and I had the opportunity to bring my daughter with me, my older girl. And when I asked her, what would you like to do now that we're in New York, she wanted to go see the Statue of Liberty. And I had never been to the Statue of Liberty before, although I'd been to New York. So I surprised her with a trip to the Statue of Liberty. And how many of you have been to see that great monument? Anybody here? Yeah. I have to tell you, going to see the Statue of Liberty, and then we went and saw Ellis Island as well, it was affecting for me as an American. I found it an emotional experience to be standing there in front of this great icon of liberty and so many of the values that are precious to me as an American. And Ellis Island, of course, I mean, how many of you know you've got relatives that came in through Ellis Island? I know I do. So being there right at the crossroads of a place where America was built in large part at a certain time of our history, again, it was emotionally affecting. From there, we went back onto the Manhattan Island, and we walked up Manhattan, and so, of course, we stopped by the 9/11 Memorial. And have you been to the 9/11 Memorial? Again, it was affecting. I mean, to see this memorial with the names of those who died etched, to watch the water falling, it was an emotional experience. And I think it would have been, if I had been, an out-of-country visitor, it could be impressive to see these places, to see these icons. But as an American, born and bred, it touched my heart to think about being an American and standing in those places and the surge of appreciation I felt, the surge of patriotism that I felt looking at Lady Liberty, standing on Ellis Island, looking down across the 9/11 Memorial. And it gave me opportunity to think again about my American identity, an identity which I really treasure and value. And we're going to end on time, so we're going to move quick. Maybe not as quick as Pastor Pierce here, but let's talk about how do Bible-believing Christians think about American identity, okay? So Bible-believing Christians in America, how do we think about our American identity? Okay, so I'm going to summarize for you some of the options that are out there. And there are fine subcategories under all of these. So we're going to do broad strokes. Is that okay today? They said, yeah, we want lunch. All right. So let's talk about Bible-believing approaches to American identity. The first one is what I'm going to call interwoven, okay? I am a Christian and I am an American, and those things, those identities are interwoven. So America is Christian, I am Christian, and the general approach to that relationship is I embrace a commingled spiritual and civil religion. We'll talk about a couple of the ways that can look like a little bit later. So Caleb Campbell in his book, Disarming Leviathan, speaks of it this way: the American civil religion and Christianity are interwoven. That's not him describing his own position, but him describing a position like this. So America is Christian, and so am I. That's one of our options, the interwoven option. Another option is what could be called a critical stance. Okay, so I'm a Christian, America is sinful, so my responsibility as a Christian, I am summoned to protest and rebuke her. This is like a prophetic, critical stance toward America, rooted in one's Christian identity. You might find people like Ron Sider, Jim Wallace, Cornel West taking this approach. A third approach, rooted in Richard Mouw, who is a Reformed theologian. I'm calling it the many chosenness. And this is the idea that America is privileged, America is favored, America is to be appreciated, but America is just one of the contexts of God's blessing and favor. God has chosen many nations. And so the emphasis is less on America as a chosen nation and more on God's choosing of many nations throughout history and even in this time. So 2 of his books that talk about this, The Kings Come Marching In. I really love this book about how to relate to culture as a Christian. He also has a great book called How to Be a Patriotic Christian, Love of Country as Love of Neighbor. So many chosenness. And then let's talk about the Adventist view. This is going to draw on what Dr. Pierce described for us and illustrated for us yesterday in his lecture. And this is how I would summarize it. Our historic Adventist position, sourced from the very beginning of our identity as a people, America is specially favored. You'll see that in our writings. America is specially favored, but flawed and destined to become a persecuting power. So you'll remember Dr. Pierce said yesterday, this approach is basically Adventists, appreciate America, but with the prophetic side eye? Oh, patriotic, but with the prophetic side eye. So as a believer, what's my stance to this? If I inhabit this historic Adventist position, I appreciate America without being blind to its defects and eventual downfall. So these may sound kind of abstract, and you'll probably, as you're listening, I imagine many of you in this room will look at this list and you'll actually find yourselves resonating with more than one of them. And that is perfectly understandable. I'd like to try to put this in sharper relief for us to understand some of the distinctions in reasoning as much as we can in such a short number of minutes by asking a question of each of these approaches. Christians who worship and Americans, how would we navigate this question? Would we pledge allegiance to the U.S. flag in a Sunday or Sabbath worship service? So, in an interwoven approach, we would say yes. I've heard this reasoning from some of my brothers and sisters in this camp. America is the reason we have freedom to worship. So when we pledge allegiance, it's in the context of our gratitude to God for that freedom, and God wants us to zealously honor our country. So in this view, because my American identity and my Christian identity are commingled, it's actually love of God to pledge allegiance to the flag. It has God's name in it, so we recognize that. And in fact, love of country is honoring to God. So in this case, there would be no conflict whatsoever, no compunction of conscience to bringing in a national flag and everyone taking a physical posture of loyalty and pronouncing basically an oath of loyalty to that symbol of national greatness. In a critical stance, they would say, no, Christians are to be good citizens, but Christians are to be good citizens by being subversive citizens. These are the words of scholar and theologian Preston Sprinkle. He says, allegiance to empire, his main metaphor for understanding America as a nation, interferes with allegiance to Christ. So, in both cases, the interwoven and the critical, they are devoted Christians and patriotic Americans, but they would have different views on how to relate to this question. The third camp, many chosenness, a Richard Mouw kind of approach, the answer would be no. The pledge, Mouw would argue, is appropriate for fostering what he calls civic kinship. It's the things we do, the rituals, the symbols, the language that binds us together as co-Americans. It's what allows us to progress together as a people. And so the Pledge of Allegiance is one of those things that fosters civic kinship, which he recognizes is a good thing. But he would push back as an opportunity for discipleship, in his words, that a ritual of flag allegiance in religious worship would cloud the fact that God deserves our first and highest and ultimate authority. So he would suggest, and people in this camp would suggest, that to do something like pledge allegiance in a Sunday service, pledge allegiance to the flag of the U.S. in a Sunday service, would be spiritually confusing, right? It would cloud the order of loyalty. And it may promote an American religious supremacy. Now, what about the Adventist view? Now, I have had the privilege of being a member and even a leader of many Adventist congregations, and they have actually approached this question differently. In some Adventist congregations in the United States, you may see the American flag displayed, and some you may not. In some, you may see the American flag in another part of the church, but not in the sanctuary. In some, you may actually have, as part of a worship service, a pledge of allegiance to the United States flag, a ritual of flag loyalty as part of the worship service, particularly usually around Veterans Day or Memorial Day or perhaps a Pathfinder Sabbath or something like that. So in my personal experience, the Adventist position on this has not been uniform. There's been a variety of approaches to this. Now, the reason that I'm wanting to take a few minutes to take a look at this slew of options, and again, there are many subcategories underneath these. There's a variety in each of these categories. Is I want us to understand a little bit more about the reasons why we might respond to certain suggestions or events with emotion. Because love of country elicits emotion. At least it does for me. Sometimes it's positive emotion, like looking at the Statue of Liberty and just thinking of all that has taken place under her watchful eye. And sometimes it's negative emotion when, foreign enemies attack or demoralize the nation. That stirs emotion in me as an American. And religion stokes our emotions, doesn't it? I mean, what is more precious to us in this room than the gospel of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? So we feel joy when we see it growing and being honored. Doesn't that fill you with joy when you watch people getting baptized, when you hear of revival? That brings joy. When you see someone coming to a knowledge of the truth, or you hear someone praising the name of Jesus, that brings joy. And doesn't it also then bring disappointment or frustration or anger when you see the cause of Christ being harmed? And so our American identity, our national identity, and our religious identity as Christians and as Seventh-day Adventists are both emotionally charged identities. And I think it's important for us to understand that there is a variety of ways that people have related those two identities together. One thing I want you to take away from this is that when you encounter people who relate those two identities in a way that you don't, I want us to be committed to the understanding that it does not call into question their religious zeal or their patriotic zeal. There are ways to be zealous for both identities at once that look different from the way that you may relate them, okay? So it's possible and even commendable to give people, wherever possible, the benefit of the doubt. And I want you to be able to examine the way you relate those two identities together. Your national identity and your Christian identity. How are those related? More interwoven, as I embrace a civil religion. To be an American is really, ideally, to be a Christian. To be a Christian is to celebrate America. Is it more critical? Is it more recognizing variety? Is it patriotic but with a prophetic side eye? And so this brings us into an opportunity to speak a little bit about this phrase, Christian nationalism. I think this, if it's not already, is fast becoming one of those devil terms that Dr. Pierce talked about. This is a nice way, or a quick way, an efficient way to debunk something if you're a certain kind of person, or to promote it if you're in a certain other camp. Christian nationalism, what is it that we're talking about? We hear it in the news, we read about it, it's in podcasts and blogs and newspaper articles, it's in conversations with friends, and it has many faces and it has a long history, which we will not have an opportunity to get fully into today. But I want us to understand, what is it that we're talking about? Let's define those terms. Let's take it from a devil term or a God term. Let's take it from an ultimate term, and let's get some definition around it so that we can more thoughtfully evaluate it as an option for relating our national and our religious identities. So Christian nationalism, as defined by Lauren Francis Turek, is an ideology or a worldview which merges religious and national identities. They are one identity. They overlap so significantly that actually to deconstruct one would essentially unravel the other. So an ideology or worldview which merges the religious and national identities. Let's talk about some of the core convictions that a Christian nationalist mindset would build on. There are actually many kinds of Christian nationalism around the world. There's not just American Christian nationalism. There's Swedish Christian nationalism and many other kinds. But let's look at American Christian nationalism and some of the core beliefs underpinning it. First of all, it is the belief that America was founded by and for Christians. And this is very important to the whole concept. America is by and for Christians. Notice that that's different from the way that our founding documents would word it, which is a government by and for the people. But this is by and for Christians. So we're starting to notice that rather than a government by and for the people, which is a basic definition of a democratic government, now it is by and for Christians, which is now a Christian supremacy. A second belief held by American Christian nationalism is that America plays an Israel-like role in God's plan for the world. So many people who would live and believe in this vein of American Christian nationalism still very much believe that Israel has a crucial and irreplaceable place in God's providential plan for the world. But America plays an Israel-like role in God's plan for the world. And you hear this come into play indirectly. So it's the kinds of metaphors that are being drawn upon. It's the kind of solutions that are being proposed. Number 3, love of God compels American patriotism. So in an American Christian nationalism, love of God compels American patriotism. So to see someone act in a way that seems to discredit or dishonor or not meet the standard of zeal for America as it's being conceived is considered not just unpatriotic or sub-patriotic, but actually unchristian. So to take a certain stance about the flag or certain policies or something like that could be construed in this mindset as an unchristian thing to do. Number 4, and finally, Christian people and Christian viewpoints ought to be prioritized above other people and viewpoints in American life. So we start to see a move here from the disestablishment of religion to a prioritization of Christian people and Christian values, beliefs, viewpoints. So American Christian nationalism is a kind of Christian supremacy that operates with a strong tension against a democratic founding and that story, that narrative of a democratic founding of the United States of America. Now, what does this look like? How does this affect the way we think and act? Well, if America is fundamentally Christian in identity, foundation, intention and destiny, that has very big implications for some other things. That tells us, that kind of creates a line in the sand for us about what's allowed and not allowed, what is promoted and what is forbidden in the way that we speak and relate to the United States of America. If America is fundamentally Christian in identity, foundation, and destiny, then critiquing America is critiquing Christianity because they're so closely related. And some of you may resonate with this, some of you may be shocked to hear it, but I've received a letter from a sincere and honest believer in our Lord Jesus Christ who told me that the foundation of the gospel is the freedom of America. And I think he meant something more nuanced than all the words he just strung together. But do you see how that sentence commingles those identities, those values, so that they're laid completely on top of each other? The foundation of the gospel is the freedom of America. So to critique America was to critique Christianity. To do something that seemed less supportive of America would be less supportive of God. So not pledging allegiance to the flag in church or not having a flag displayed on the platform next to the cross would be not just sub-patriotic, not just less than their ideal of patriotism, but also less than properly Christian. If America is fundamentally Christian, then supporting American success is supporting the success of Christianity. And success is sometimes conceived of in moral terms, right? So the rejoicing that we may see when laws are passed or repealed or overturned, success in that case is being conceived in moral terms. But sometimes it as purely financial terms. So the success, supporting American success with a strong economy and trade deals is supporting Christian success. So hearing people giving prayer instruction to their parishioners and followers, we need to pray against Chinese manufacturing. Okay? So why are they saying that? You could frame it in a few ways. One of those is because they see that Chinese manufacturing is undermining the strength and success of America, which is undermining God's Christian cause in the world. Because remember, America holds an Israel-like role in world events. And also, purifying and protecting America is purifying or protecting the Christian cause. So sometimes that success is actually militaristic. Right? It's victory in battle. It's our strength on the world stage. This language is even invoked when we talk about borders. Now, not every conversation about immigration needs to fall into this way of thinking, but they can operate so closely together, people may fall into thinking that purifying and protecting America is purifying and protecting the Christian cause. So it's preserving America against what is seen to be non-American. So non-Christian religions, even certain economic theories, immigrants, of course. And there is a version of American Christian nationalism which is also racialized, concerned with whiteness, in which case the presence, power, or influence or concentration of non-white people is a threat to America and America's Christianity. You can see how when you get a few dominoes in a row, the others fall just so easily. If we believe that America is fundamentally Christian in its identity and destiny and purpose, that it was founded by and for Christians, then to promote, to purify, to protect America is to support God's cause in the world. Related to this, American prosperity, then, requires religious revival. And so we saw, you remember if you were here yesterday, Dr. Pierce reminded us about Amy Semple McPherson and the calls for revival coming there. We see revival coming as a political practice because it is a way of solving political problems. Revival is part of the American experience. The First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening. In the 20th century, we have a wave of revivals that move through the country. And those take on a different tenor as time goes on in different pockets. So revival becomes a political practice. So an American nationalist revival would seek to return their nation to its Christian moorings, opposing secularism and progressivism as antithetical to Christianity. So we see America is being undermined by these powers. We're going to get right with God. We're going to get zealous. We're going to go to our knees, and we're going to save America and thus save God's cause in the world. A revivalist nationalism, as described by scholar Daniel Hummel, seeks to reinvigorate the Christian principles of the nation as the primary goal. And eventually we see over time it begins to supersede the goal of a revival, as maybe you or I understand it, as individual personal salvation. So let's get another picture of Billy Graham up on the screen, hey? Look at that guy. He's telling it like it is. Billy Graham begins his revival campaigns. He begins with an emphasis on individual personal salvation. I will not take the time to talk about the way that changes as we get to Harold Ockenga and Bill Bright, into Jerry Falwell. Ronald Reagan himself was not a religious revivalist, but his campaign and the era of his presidency opened the door and was promoted in part by something known as the religious right, which sought, among many other things, to bring the nation to revival, to create a new surge of renewed success for the American nation. So although Ronald Reagan himself was not a religious revivalist, he was certainly a political revivalist, and the religionists at his elbow had no problem using religious revival to support the cause. And then I put a name here that you may or may not know, Sean Feucht. He and I happen to be born the same year, I learned. Sean Feucht is so much to say. Okay, let's see. Sean Feucht is a religious revivalist who believes and promotes the message that worship is a weapon against all of Satan's schemes, and that very clearly became concentrated, especially in 2020, on the devil's political schemes. And so we were having worship services under Sean and other people like him, but he's a great primary character. Religious revivals under leadership like this that was both Pentecostal, political, that was using language of the military. It was language of invasion. It was language of expanding spiritual territory. It was the language of weaponry. It was the language of opposition and warfare. And there's so much to say. Okay, I need to get to things that you can take with you. Okay. This statement, if you've read C.S. Lewis's book, The Four Loves, he quotes the philosopher saying, "Love ceases to be a demon only when he ceases to be a god." And C.S. Lewis turns this around and says, so love is a god only when it ceases to be a demon. What he means by this, and he elaborates in his book, is that love, a word we love to promote, support, endorse. As readers of the Bible, we see that word used so importantly in relation to God and others in the church, that when our love for some person, institution, becomes a god to us, it acts in the way of demons. It begins to align not with righteousness and holiness and goodness, but with evil and harm to others. So he uses as an example, for instance, you would think the love of a mother for her child. Now, I have 2 children of my own. Obviously, they're the 2 greatest kids ever, and I love them. I truly do. And parents in here, grandparents, aunts, uncles, you know what it is to love a child, right? And that's a good thing. Is it good that we love our children? Absolutely. It's great. It's perfect. It's just as it should be. But there is a scenario in which the love of one's child begins to be deformed. Love of one's child takes precedence over other love of other things to such a degree that one may think, well, my child really is the best and the brightest. My child deserves privileges and opportunities that those other lesser children really don't deserve. And you know what? When my daughter pushes another kid down on the playground, I'm pretty sure he deserved it. And she's going to get a lollipop when she gets home. Good job pushing that lesser child out of the way. When a teacher dares suggest that my child might need some reading remediation, obviously that's a reflection on her poor judgment and lack of training. And I'm going straight to the principal with that. Because how could you say something about this beautiful child of mine? That's starting to feel like a personal insult. I think you have a vendetta against me. Even the most natural and good love, the love of a parent for their child, can be deformed when it's out of order. And what about love of country? I believe it is the conviction of my heart and of my life that it is good to love one's country, as one would love one's family. And I don't know about your family, but when we are placed in a family, we are set there with certain obligations and rights and privileges, right? But there is a scenario often replayed in Christian churches, homes, car rides, conversations, podcasts, live streams, in which love of country has become so supreme that it has become deformed. So as to think that this love that I have, which is so natural and so good, would authorize me to act in a way that is less like God and more like his enemies, to love my neighbors less in the name of the God who tells me to love my neighbors. Looking at our time here, allow me to end with this, which is the chorus of my presentations here today and all this week. Our love of country, our love of this place, of its people, of the goodness of its history, of the memories, the nostalgia, even the goodness of its promises, ought never to lead us astray, to confuse who is the King. Jesus is King, and he shares his throne with no other. No party, no president, no platform of national interest. Jesus is King, and his supremacy knows no rival, and it knows no bounds. So, brothers and sisters, let us be sure that our patriotism is not so small as to make us merely American. Let us be sure that our religious zeal is not so weak as to give Jesus any competition, but to clarify that Jesus and our love for him is first, best, always, and last. And every other love finds its place beneath that. Let us pray. Lord God in heaven, we thank you for the opportunity that we've had to think together. And Jesus, we ask that in your lordship, that you would rightly order our thoughts, our affections, our decisions, our behaviors, and our allegiances. That we would understand you as you are, that we may understand ourselves as we are. And we thank you for being our good, our gracious, and the only perfect King. It's in your unrivaled, beautiful name we pray. Amen. Amen. Thank you, friends.